In the early 1960s, Pontiac built an engine so brutally fast, so dominant on the drag strip and oval track, that it forced GM's hand and changed the course of American automotive history. This is the story of the Pontiac 421 Super Duty, an engine that was supposed to be a secret, a factory race motor that embarrassed the competition and ultimately became so successful that it had to be killed. Let's dive into one of the most legendary and rare engines in American muscle car history. To understand the 421 Super Duty, we need to rewind to the late 1950s. At that time, Pontiac was struggling. The brand had earned a reputation for building stodgy, uninspiring cars that appealed to older buyers. Sales were declining, and the future looked bleak. But everything changed when Seaman Bunky Knudsen took over as general manager in 1956. Knudsen knew that Pontiac needed a dramatic image makeover, and he believed racing was the key. The only problem? In 1957, the Automobile Manufacturers Association, the AMA, had established what became known as the Gentleman's Agreement, which called for all automakers to withdraw from factory-backed racing and stop promoting speed and performance. This agreement came about following fatal crashes at the 1956 Indianapolis 500 and 24 Hours of Le Mans, along with growing public concern about street racing and automotive safety. General Motors, being the industry giant that controlled roughly half the U.S. market, took this agreement seriously. At least, that's what they wanted everyone to believe. But Bunky Knudsen had other plans. As Jim Wangers, Pontiac's legendary ad man, later recalled, Knudsen's attitude was essentially, "To hell with those guys. I've got a division to save, and we're going racing." And race they did. While other manufacturers went to sleep, Pontiac went full throttle. In 1959, they developed the 389 cubic inch V8 by stroking out the earlier 370. This engine quickly became known as the Trophy 8 and was available with various carburetor setups, including the famous Tri-Power configuration with 3 two-barrel carburetors. Pontiac's racing efforts started paying off. Despite the AMA ban, Pontiac, through what we might call unofficial factory support, began dominating on the track. In 1959, they won just one NASCAR Grand National race, but in 1960, they scored 6 victories. In 1961, that number exploded to 30 wins in NASCAR alone. They were also cleaning up at the drag strip, winning NHRA championships and setting records left and right. But Pontiac's engineers knew that to stay ahead of the competition, especially with Ford, Chrysler, and even sister division Chevrolet ramping up their performance programs, they needed something bigger, something more powerful. They needed to go beyond the 389. In 1961, the superstock drag racing category was absolutely packed with big displacement engines. Chevrolet had its 409. Ford was bringing serious horsepower, and Dodge had just introduced the 413 Max Wedge. Pontiac's largest engine at the time was the 389, which was competitive but not quite enough to dominate the way Knudsen wanted. So Pontiac's engineers got to work. They took the 389 and increased both the bore and stroke, creating a 421 cubic inch monster. This wasn't just a simple enlargement. The 421 introduced what became known as big journal main bearings, measuring 3 1/4 inches in diameter. This was a significant change from the smaller journals used in the 389, and it caused some controversy within Pontiac's engineering department. Legendary race mechanic Smokey Yunick left Pontiac over this very issue, believing the larger journals would hurt high RPM performance. But the bigger journals made the engine incredibly strong and durable, which was essential for the brutal conditions of drag racing and stock car competition. The 421 featured a 4.09-inch bore and a 4-inch stroke. It was packed with race-ready components, a forged steel crankshaft, forged steel connecting rods, forged aluminum pistons, many built by none other than Mickey Thompson, and special high-flow cylinder heads. Now, here's where things get interesting. Just before the NHRA U.S. Nationals on Labor Day weekend in 1961, Pontiac made an announcement. They were now offering a 421 cubic inch high-performance engine option to qualified drivers. The engine could be fitted to any Catalina or Ventura two-door model, but it was available only with related heavy-duty driveline components. The keyword here was qualified drivers. This wasn't something you could just walk into a dealership and order like a radio or air conditioning. The 421 Super Duty was initially a dealer-installed over-the-counter option, essentially a crate engine for racers. The components were shipped to factory-backed race teams for post-delivery installation. The engine made its competition debut earlier than that Labor Day announcement, though. In August 1961, at the Pomona Valley Timing Association meet in California, racer Hayden Proffitt piloted a 421-equipped Pontiac built by Mickey Thompson to victory. But the real coming-out party was at the NHRA U.S. Nationals in Indianapolis that September. Proffitt's Pontiac ran the quarter mile in 12.55 seconds at 110 miles per hour, making it the only 12-second car in stock Eliminator. The competition didn't stand a chance. Pontiac officially rated the 421 Super Duty at 405 horsepower, but that number was, to put it mildly, conservative. Motor Trend tested one in 1962 and found that the engine was actually producing around 465 horsepower and 505 pound-feet of torque at the flywheel. A confidential internal memo from Vince Piggins at Chevrolet, who was keeping close tabs on Pontiac's performance, revealed that the 1963 version of the 421 was putting out approximately 468 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. The engine came with dual Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetors, each flowing 500 cubic feet per minute, mounted on a special aluminum intake manifold. The setup included a solid lifter camshaft with extreme duration and lift, courtesy of Pontiac engineer Malcolm McKellar. This became known as the McKellar No. 10 cam, and it allowed the engine to rev as high as 6,400 RPM. Absolutely insane for a full-size car engine in the early 1960s. The Super Duty 421's overwhelming success created a problem for Pontiac. The NHRA changed its rulebook for 1962, requiring that engines and body parts used in stock classes had to be factory-installed production pieces, not just dealer add-ons. This forced Pontiac's hand. If they wanted to keep racing and winning, they had to make the 421 Super Duty a regular production option. And that's exactly what they did. For the 1962 model year, Pontiac offered the Super Duty 421 as a factory-installed option on Catalina and Grand Prix two-door models. But calling it a production option doesn't really capture what this was. The 421 Super Duty cost about $2,250, a massive premium when the base Catalina itself listed at only $2,725. You were essentially paying the price of another car just for the engine package. And what a package it was. The 421 came with 4-bolt main bearing caps, forged internals, NASCAR-spec cylinder heads, and free-flowing cast-iron exhaust headers with removable dumps so racers could run straight pipes at the track. The engine was mated exclusively to heavy-duty manual transmissions, either a 3-speed or a Borg-Warner T10 4-speed. Pontiac's automatic wasn't strong enough to handle the torque. But the Super Duty package went far beyond just the engine. Pontiac offered a host of weight-saving options, including an aluminum front-end body clip, aluminum fenders, hood, radiator support, and even bumpers. These aluminum pieces could shed nearly 200 pounds from the car's nose. Some sources suggest that all Super Duty cars were built with these aluminum components, unless the buyer specifically requested otherwise. Production numbers tell the story of just how rare these cars were. In 1962, Pontiac built only 155 Catalinas and 16 Grand Prix models with the 421 Super Duty engine. In numerical symmetry that probably wasn't accidental, Pontiac built exactly 421 total Catalinas with the 421 engine that year, when you include all the different variants. These cars dominated the 1962 NASCAR season. They were absolutely unstoppable on the drag strip and formidable on the oval tracks. The competition, Ford, Chevrolet, Chrysler, was scrambling to catch up, and Pontiac was loving every minute of it. By late 1962, Pontiac's engineers recognized a growing problem. While they were still winning, Ford, Chrysler, and Chevrolet were closing the gap with bigger engines and their own lightweight components. If Pontiac wanted to maintain its dominance in 1963, they needed to take weight reduction to an extreme level. The result was one of the most legendary and frankly insane pieces of automotive engineering in history, the Swiss cheese Catalina. Here's what they did. Pontiac engineers took the Catalina's frame and modified the boxed rails by cutting away the top section, leaving a U-shaped channel. Then they drilled approximately 120 to 130 large diameter holes throughout the frame rails. Yes, you heard that right. They deliberately turned the car's structural chassis into something resembling Swiss cheese. But that was just the beginning. They deleted the front sway bar since it wasn't needed for straight-line drag racing. They stripped out the sound deadening, body sealers, and insulation. The aluminum body panels from 1962 were made even thinner for 1963, so thin, according to some accounts, that you could dent them with a hard thumb press. The exhaust manifolds were cast in aluminum, weighing just 27 pounds per pair compared to 72 pounds for cast iron units. However, these aluminum manifolds had a fatal flaw. They couldn't withstand sustained high temperatures. Smokey Yunick reported they were completely spent after just 10 laps on a NASCAR track. Even the bell housing and rear differential center section were made from aluminum. Heaters and radios were deleted. Some cars even used plexiglass side windows to save additional weight. The interior was stripped down to bare essentials, just a bench seat and not much else. The Swiss cheese Catalinas weighed approximately 3,300 pounds, down from the standard Catalina's 3,550 pounds. That might not sound like much by modern standards, but combined with the 421 Super Duty's underrated power output, realistically closer to 500 horsepower when properly tuned, these cars were absolute weapons. They were running low 12-second quarter-mile times at speeds approaching 120 miles per hour. Only 14 Swiss cheese Catalinas were ever built. These weren't sold through dealerships. They were given to select established racers who Pontiac knew could showcase the car's capabilities. Names like Mickey Thompson, Arnie the Farmer Bestwick, and Jim Wangers received these special machines. The Swiss cheese program had one major drawback, though. The drilled-out frames were so weak that they had to be braced with stout timbers during the assembly process to prevent them from folding or twisting when flipped over by the hydraulic machines on the production line. In competition, many of these frames eventually cracked or failed, requiring replacement or extensive repair work. In retrospect, it wasn't the smartest engineering decision, but it showed just how far Pontiac was willing to go to win. While Pontiac was winning races and selling cars on the strength of its performance image, storm clouds were gathering at GM's corporate headquarters in Detroit. Remember, GM controlled more than half of the U.S. automotive market in the early 1960s. This put them squarely in the crosshairs of the U.S. Justice Department's antitrust division. The government had already broken up Standard Oil decades earlier, and there was very real concern that GM might face the same fate if their market share approached 60%. By mid-1962, the situation had become tense. Henry Ford II, frustrated that other manufacturers weren't really following the AMA agreement, officially withdrew Ford Motor Company from the ban in June 1962. Ford wanted to openly promote their racing programs because they believed, correctly, that racing success translated into sales. Chrysler immediately followed suit, arguing that Ford's withdrawal nullified the original agreement. This put enormous pressure on GM. Not only were Ford and Chrysler now openly supporting racing, but Pontiac and Chevrolet were flagrantly violating GM's supposed adherence to the AMA ban with barely concealed factory support. The 421 Super Duty program and Chevrolet's development of their mystery motor 427 Big Block were obvious examples. Then, on January 18, 1963, American Motors president Roy Abernethy gave a speech to Detroit's AdCraft Club. He criticized the automakers who had withdrawn from the AMA agreement, warning that their advertisements promoting speed and horsepower would draw unwanted attention from the federal government and negative public sentiment. In the hours following that speech, GM's top executives held an emergency meeting. Whether they were actually pressured by the federal government or simply fearful of that possibility remains unclear to this day. But the decision was made. All GM divisions were to immediately cease all factory racing programs and discontinue availability of race-specific engines, like Pontiac's Super Duty 421 and Chevrolet's 427 Mystery Motor. The edict came down on January 24, 1963. It was the end of the road for the Super Duty program that had transformed Pontiac's image and made them a performance powerhouse. By the time the ban was officially announced, Pontiac had already been working on a limited number of 1963 models. A total of 88 Super Duty engines made it out the door that year, including those 14 Swiss cheese Catalinas and a handful of lightweight Tempest compacts, but that's a story for another time. The immediate impact of GM's racing ban was devastating for Pontiac. Virtually overnight, they lost their dominance on the track. The carefully cultivated performance image that Bunky Knudsen had built was in jeopardy. But here's the thing. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. The Super Duty program had proven something crucial, that Pontiac could build world-class performance engines and that there was a huge market for fast, powerful cars. The racing success had created an army of Pontiac enthusiasts and given dealers a blueprint for how to sell performance. Jim Wangers, that legendary ad man we mentioned earlier, had been running what he called performance seminars at Pontiac dealerships, teaching them how to promote and sell speed equipment. Since dealers were independent franchises, they weren't bound by GM's corporate policy. This created a workaround that kept performance in the conversation even after the racing ban. More importantly, the engineering knowledge gained from the Super Duty program didn't disappear. The 421 had proven the viability of Pontiac's V8 architecture for high-performance applications. All the lessons learned about cylinder head design, camshaft profiles, induction systems, and durability would flow directly into Pontiac's next generation of engines. In 1964, less than a year after the racing ban, Pontiac would introduce the GTO, widely considered the first true muscle car. The GTO was essentially the Tempest compact with a 389 cubic inch V8 shoehorned under the hood, offered as an option package to circumvent GM's rule limiting engine displacement in midsize cars. That 389 was a direct descendant of the Super Duty program's development work. The GTO was supposed to sell 5,000 units. Instead, over 32,000 were sold in its first year. By 1966, sales had more than doubled. The muscle car era had officially begun, and it was built on the foundation of the 421 Super Duty's racing success. In 1967, Pontiac retired the 389 and replaced it with the 400 cubic inch V8, essentially a bored-out 389 with improved cylinder heads and better breathing. This engine would power some of the most iconic muscle cars of the late 1960s and early 1970s, including the GTO, Firebird, and Trans Am. The 421 itself continued in production through 1966, though never again in Super Duty form. It was enlarged to 428 cubic inches in 1967, Pontiac's answer to Chevrolet's 427 and Ford's 428, by increasing the bore slightly. And in 1970, Pontiac introduced the 455, a bored and stroked version of the big block architecture that traced its lineage directly back to that first 421 Super Duty. Today, Super Duty Pontiacs are among the most valuable and collectible muscle cars in existence. A legitimate 1962 or 1963 Super Duty Catalina can command values approaching $500,000. The Swiss cheese cars are essentially priceless, with most residing in museum collections or with serious Pontiac historians. But the 421 Super Duty significance goes beyond dollar values. This engine represents a pivotal moment in American automotive history, the point where performance went from being something you might find at a backwater dirt track to a mainstream marketing tool that could transform a struggling brand into an industry leader. The 421 Super Duty also represents the last gasp of an era when manufacturers could build truly specialized racing equipment and sell it through dealerships with minimal restrictions. By the time GM lifted its internal racing ban in the late 1960s, the rules had changed. Homologation requirements became stricter. Emissions regulations started choking power. The freewheeling days of drilling holes in frames and shipping race engines in crates were over. Perhaps most importantly, the 421 Super Duty program proved that racing really did have value beyond the track. Pontiac's sales increased dramatically during the Super Duty years. The brand went from stodgy and old-fashioned to exciting and desirable. Young buyers who might have never considered a Pontiac suddenly wanted one because they'd seen them dominating at the drag strip or winning on the NASCAR circuit. That win on Sunday, sell on Monday philosophy wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was demonstrably true, and the 421 Super Duty was the proof. The Pontiac 421 Super Duty ran for only about 2 years in its factory race form, with fewer than 200 examples ever produced. It was an engine that GM tried to downplay, then tried to hide, and finally had to kill. But in that brief window, it changed everything. It proved that Pontiac could compete with anyone. It launched the muscle car era, and it created a legend that still resonates more than 60 years later. The 421 Super Duty wasn't just an engine, it was a statement. And that statement was heard loud and clear, both on the track and in showrooms across America.